The muscle starts from a bone with a tendon in between attaching them. Inside the muscle, there are layers called the epimysium, the endomysium, and the perimysium. Inside the muscle belly, there are these things called vesicles. These contain the axon of the motor neuron. Inside the vesicles, there are muscle fibers. The sarcolemma and the sarcoplasmic reticulum surround the fibers. Inside the muscle fibers, there are the thin and thick filaments. The thin filaments are made up of myosin, and the thin are made up of actin. So here's another way to show the anatomy of a skeletal muscle, and I will be telling you some key features in a skeletal muscle. The epimysium, also known as the muscle belly, is connective tissue that holds together and envelopes the entire muscle. The perimysium is a sheath of connective tissue that binds groups of muscle fibers together. A vesicle is a bundle of skeletal muscle fibers surrounded by perimysium. The endomysium is a sheath of connective tissue that surrounds the muscle fibers. Beneath this lies a plasma membrane, the sarcolemma, which contains the muscle cell's cytoplasm, the sarcoplasm.
The sarcolemma is a plasmic membrane that lies beneath the endomysium. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is the muscle cell's cytoplasm that is contained by the sarcolemma. The myofibrils are thread-like structures that contain finer thick and thin filaments. These are the cellular proteins myosin and actin. Myosin are the thick filaments and actin are the thin filaments. So this is the first step in a muscle contraction. So first, the brain sends a neuron signal or an action potential that travels down the axon. If the dendrites get enough stimulus to reach the threshold, then depolarization occurs. This means that sodium rushes in and potassium rushes out. So here would be the depolarization. So when the sodium goes in, it turns positive on the inside and negative on the outside. And this continues to travel down the axon. Then, the action potential continues to run down the axon until it gets to the neuromuscular junction. Here, calcium will rush in. Then, acetylcholine gets released and binds to acetylcholine receptors. When the acetylcholine binds to the receptors, it opens calcium channels. The calcium flows down the channels and then the action potential continues on to both sides of the sarcolemma. Here, it depolarizes. Then, the action potential goes on to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Here, calcium comes in. Then, the calcium binds to the troponin, which is on the actin. This changes the makeup of troponin to open the binding site for myosin.
So these myosin fibers both need ATP in order to join. Once they are provided ATP, it will attach to the actin, and then once that ATP is converted to ADP plus energy, it will move the actin, and once the ADP gets released, the myosin will let go, and then it will go over and over again. So ATP will be provided, it will attach, swing, ADP is made with energy, and it will release, and myosin lets go. Sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. The myosin of the thick filament blends with the actin of thin filaments, forming something called actomyosin and assisting the filaments to slide past each other. The myosin of the thick filaments has unique structure that is globular. The myosin of the thick filament has globular structures that interact with special active sites on the actin filament to form a bond called a cross bridge. The globular heads of the myosin are active in moving the actin filaments. The myosin contains ATP sites and active enzyme to split the ATP and release energy for the reaction. The actin filament contains the protein tropomyosin that plays a critical role in regulating the filament's function. It prevents and regulates interaction of actin and myosin. And a little summary is, according to the sliding filament theory, the myosin, thick filaments of the muscle fibers slide past the actin, which are thin filaments, during muscle contraction, while the two groups of filaments remain at relative constant length. And here's a quick reminder of all the structures involved.
A myofibril is a cylindrical organelle running the length of the muscle fiber containing actin and myosin filaments. The sarcomere is the functional unit of the myofibril divided into A, I, and H bands. Actin is a thin, contractile protein filament containing active or binding sites. Myosin is a thick, contractile protein filament with protrusions known as myosin heads. Tropomyosin is an actin binding protein which regulates muscle contraction, and troponin is a complex of 3 proteins attached to tropomyosin. The all or none law is the principle that the strength by which a nerve or muscle fiber responds to a stimulus, and it does not rely on the strength of that stimulus. If the stimulus exceeds the threshold potential, the nerve or muscle fiber will give a complete response. Otherwise, if it does not exceed the threshold potential, there will be no response. This is why we sometimes move our muscles with more force than we anticipated. For example, when you go to lightly hit someone but ending up hitting them a lot harder than you meant to. Fast twitch fibers are used for short, fast bursts of energy. They use anaerobic metabolism for fuel. These muscle fibers fatigue faster than slow twitch fibers. They are great for sprinters. Slow twitch fibers use oxygen for fuel. They allow for continuous energy and muscle contraction. These fibers fire a lot slower than fast twitch fibers. This is why they are great for long distance runners, bikers, or anything that requires a long amount of energy. Slow and fast twitch fibers both exert the same amount of energy when they fire, but the difference is that fast twitch fibers can fire much more rapidly than slow twitch fibers.
How muscles work to create movement / different types of contractions. Muscles create movement by contractions called isotonic contractions. These contractions can be concentric or eccentric. Concentric is when the muscle shortens, and eccentric is when the muscle lengthens. If the muscle contracts with no resulting movement, this is called an isometric contraction.
The different parts of muscle contraction and how they all work together allow Sam to pick up a pencil, run a lap of the track, or jump in the snow.